people will believe what they want to believe. And if the internet also leads to that. So you Google, do zombies exist? Google will give you an answer yes, because Google senses that that's the answer you want. And the more you Google that question, the more evidence you'll get every time you Google.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Trolling with Logic, where I'm not going to go with the standard introduction that we usually go with, because we're talking about something a little bit different this time that's kind of on the borderlands between science and fiction. We're talking about brains and zombies and what science has to say about it. Our special guest for this episode is Dr. Steven Schlozman. He is an assistant professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. His clinical work focuses on psychotherapeutic and psychopharmacologic treatments, and his academic work is geared not only towards the psychiatric treatment of medically ill children, but also curriculum reform and educational endeavors for medical students. He's the author of the 2011 novel, The Zombie Autopsies, Secret Notebooks from the Apocalypse, a story of a zombie outbreak told from the point of view of a medical researcher. He joins us on the podcast to talk about the medical research that informs his novel and about zombie outbreaks in general. What's science and what's fiction? Welcome to the show, Dr. Steven Schlozman.
Thanks. You have to call me Steve. Only my mother calls me Dr. Schlozman. So.
I guess the first question we'll go with is talking about your book itself. Could it be considered a hard science fiction novel, falling into that kind of genre of stories that are informed by real science as much as possible?
Yeah, no, that was the goal. So some folks have called it speculative fiction. It's not quite as speculative as something like Black Mirror, which is amazing and horrifying because it's so close to possible. I should lead. In fact, I begin every one of these discussions with the disclaimer, which is, by the way, required by my employer, which this may come as a surprise to you, but Harvard is a bit of a stodgy place. And so they have suggested that I always remind people that zombies are fiction in case people think otherwise. So I'm going to be very clear about that. But I wanted to write it as if they weren't. So I tried to use the neurobiology and the pathology and also the microbiology to make a zombie apocalyptic scenario as believable as possible, and then to figure out how we could do what doctors do, which is not blow their heads off, but to make them better, to cure. These are sick people, so we try and cure them. And it kind of works in the novel. I think the novel works. Whether we cure the zombies, that's the question.
Yeah, I would agree that the novel works if for no other reason than we have things like the CDC using the idea of a zombie apocalypse to teach disaster preparedness.
Oh, yeah. In fact, you want to hear a funny story about that? Can I tell you a funny story? I know this. This is my funny story. The CDC talked about disaster preparedness, used the disease that I made up in this book, ataxic neurodegenerative satiety deficiency syndrome, ANSD. They just used it, which is fine. It was cool. But they misspelled my last name, which is totally fine with me, but not fine with my nice Jewish mother, who was very upset and actually called the CDC. Like, she called my Kansas City-based nice Jewish mother, calls up the CDC and says, "I'm very pleased you put my son in there, but could you please spell his last name correctly?" And they changed it like within seconds. She must have terrified them in some way, which she's been doing since I was 4, when she would like march into the schools and talk to the principals and stuff. So yes, the CDC did use zombie preparedness as a model for all disaster preparedness, whether it's a pandemic or a natural disaster. And actually, it maps pretty well.
Yeah, there's one thing I've always wondered, and it's just the whole zombie phenomenon. It's like the one, like all other genres of horror go through their phases of popularity, but zombies just seem to be this constant, and there's always this appeal to it. What is it about it that keeps, that movie makers and novelists and all that, they just seem to find it so fertile for stories, this?
They're blank slates by definition, not even as a metaphor. They are by definition blanks. So you can project onto them, displace onto them any idea that you're working with. I knew George Romero very well. He passed away this summer, but he actually optioned the book I wrote, and we wrote the screenplay together. So we had a good time with that. He would say zombies are the thing that happens. Like they're not about zombies themselves. They're about how humans respond to zombies. And, if you think about it, like a vampire wants you to think you're sexy. You might not be sexy, but the vampire's whole thing is to make you think you're sexy. The werewolf's like an angry dog, like ghosts want to scare you. Zombies are just crocodiles. They don't really care. You can't get mad at a zombie. It's like getting mad at a crocodile. So it becomes this everything, this sort of mindless thing that nevertheless will devour you. And I think that's a pretty good metaphor for what modern life is like. It's the same as being.
This is something that this idea of the zombie as a blank slate that isn't really about the zombie itself, but about how humans respond to it. This is where I think the appeal and greatness of shows like The Walking Dead come in, because what The Walking Dead does is it isn't really about the zombies. It's about humans and their response to it. And the biggest threat in The Walking Dead is other humans.
Oh, yeah. By far. I mean, the zombies aren't a problem. All you have to do is walk slightly faster to get away. They're stumbling. But if you decide you can't sit next to somebody because you don't like the color of their skin, you're in trouble, because we need each other more than we don't need each other.
Yeah, I also think zombie stories probably tap into our evolutionary past in some way. There's a fear we've inherited and that we still carry around, like in our reptilian brain, a fear of predators and being eaten. And I think that's part of the appeal of it. It taps into something in our reptilian brain, and it also taps into something higher up. I think the loss of identity is also something people are scared of. Somebody familiar to us, or who was familiar to us, is now this relentless monster who wants to not have dinner with us, but eat us.
Right. And doesn't even, it's not even about you. Like, even if it was, if you think about like, the classic foggy football field, and there's what you think and hope is your girlfriend stumbling across the field out of the fog, and she might be dragging her foot, but you think maybe it's broken, and then she might take a bite out of somebody, and you still think to yourself, God, I hope it's just her and I can make her better. And you wait just long enough for her to bite you. But the irony there is that at least she's biting you. So in some ways she still cares about you, except she doesn't. You could step to the right and she'll bite the guy next to you. So it's this mindless predatory fear that we have. I think if something's going to eviscerate us, we'd like it to be about us. Like, you want your guts to matter. And the idea that your guts aren't any more special than the other guy's guts, that's absolutely terrifying. And then the higher brain stuff is, trying to figure out what to do. There's this whole philosophical world of studying zombies. They talk about inverse zombies and physical zombies, P zombies and I zombies. And physical zombies are the ones like Romero thought about, stumbling around upright. And then the big philosophical question is, are they conscious by definition? Because how do you define consciousness? If they're up, if they're seeking food, if they're responding to stimuli, is that the same thing as you and I when we're seeking, a bowl of cereal in the middle of the night? Whereas the inverse zombie, or the kind of creepy stories you hear about people who the doctors think are under general anesthesia, but they're not, and they go ahead and do the surgery. So that's actually the phrase they use in the philosophical papers. So it lends itself to all of these highbrow discussions that are a lot easier to have in the displacement of a zombie story than they are in real life, but they're real life questions.
I also think one of the appeals of the zombie genre is that a lot of people who enjoy it have some form of escapism. Everybody thinks that if a zombie apocalypse does occur, they'll instantly become the next Rick Grimes or the next Daryl Dixon. And so, which of course, this isn't going to happen.
Everyone's got their plan. I always tell people, I'm a shrink, so I'm not going to be much use in the field if someone's blown their arm off or something. I can't really hang a picture, so I'm not going to be good at building anything. I'm not a very good shot. I shot rifles in summer camp. I'm going to have to tell stories, but then I think to myself, well, Homer told stories in really barbaric times, and he was blind, and as long as he didn't finish the story, they fed him. So I would just drag my family from place to place and tell them a story, and hopefully they would give me baked beans or something, and I could move on to the next, stronghold, and hope I don't run into the governor or something like that. If I did, hopefully he'd like my story and not kill me. I mean, that is the fun of the zombie trope. It's like, how would you survive? And at the end of the day, it's got to be, I would survive by using my head, by not, everyone says, well, I'd ride a bike and I would I'd have 6 layers of leather so the teeth can't get through and et cetera, et cetera. No, what you would survive by is by making friends. I think that's their best bet.
Yeah, I think storytelling probably has conferred some kind of evolutionary advantage in the past. I think there's some kind of selective advantage, however slight, in the ability to manipulate abstract concepts and turn them into a story based on real experiences. And I think probably the analog of zombie stories in our hunter-gatherer days were stories about predators and around the campfire. And that's probably borne out in the cave paintings and such.
Yeah, I think so. It's funny. I never thought of it that way, but I absolutely agree with you. There's this whole anthropologic theory that in addition to Homo sapiens, we should consider ourselves Homo narrans, or the species that tells stories, because we're the only, as far as we know, I suppose that's a little human-centric since we don't know whether primates are telling stories in their own way.
Oh, okay. Going on to the real science that kind of informs the storytelling, are there examples that you are aware of what we could call zombies in real life, in nature?
Sure. Yeah. So there's been a lot written about this lately. So we'll start with the zombies that I wrote about, because I was trying to think of brain conditions that could mimic the zombie-like presentation that you see in Romero's films. And we're focusing here, at least I'm focusing on the slow-moving zombies. They actually map better onto brain pathology than does the fast-moving ones. So there's the obvious one would be something like rabies. There's one problem with rabies. So you do get the hyper-aggressiveness. You do get people who are necessarily going to die. You do remove the frontal lobe from the picture with rabies, so you can't think carefully. You can't solve problems. You do lose coordination, so you get the truncal ataxia, the kind of wandering back and forth with your arms out in front of you to maintain balance. What you don't do is eat. People with rabies are not only not hungry, they are terrified of food because they can't swallow. It hurts like heck to swallow anything. They get hydrophobia, so if you show them a glass of water, they'll actually shirk and knock it out of your hands. So that one doesn't quite work, but you'd have to sort of modify the rabies virus a little bit. I went with prions, which are these proteins that are in all of our brains all the time, but are usually in this alpha helical shape, which makes them safe. If they shift towards the beta side, then you can start to eat away at your brain, the same way mad cow disease does, or scabies, or any of those horrible diseases. Then you have to have, so the big trick is to make somebody feel as sick as they have, but also to be hungry. Because that's really rare. It's really rare to have a fever and, say, full-blown Creutzfeldt-Jakob's and also have hunger. But you can do it. There's some viruses that invade the ventromedial hypothalamus and make you hungry. Adenoviruses are the most common kind. Those are just cold viruses. And for some folks, because they have a genetic vulnerability, it invades that region of the brain and people become pathologically obese. And you can demonstrate this in lab animals as well. So you'd have to have a combination of a bunch of different contagions to create the kind of human zombie picture. In nature, you've got some already. My favorite one is the thing that's in cat litter. I'm blanking on the name of the parasite right now. It's basically, it's on the tip of my tongue, and I'll think of it as we're talking. If a rat eats this virus, so this parasite, it's a multicellular.
Toxoplasmosis, the one that is coming to my mind.
Yes, thank you. Toxoplasmosis carinii. Thank you. So that requires the cat gut to reproduce, but it's carried by rats or mice. And once it's invaded the rat or mouse's brain, rather than the rat or mouse running from cats, as is the evolutionary adaptive thing for it to do, it actually runs towards the cat, and the cat eats it. So now you've got a virus hijacking the normal evolutionary response of the animal. There's also some funguses that invade ants, which I'm sure you guys have read about, and also some wasps that get invaded in the same way, take over their brain, and then eventually, before the ant will leave the ant colony, wander off, start eating the leaves that actually best serve this fungus's nutritional needs, until the fungus grows so much that it literally bursts out of the top of the ant's head, which is pretty gross. But the movie The Girl with All the Gifts was based on that bug. Are you saying that scientifically, or because of a special feeling you have towards cats, or both?
I hope it's both, but it's also probably has more to do with a personal feeling about cats.
I have a friend who's a medical examiner who tells me in New York City, you're often called to someone's house because someone's passed, or the landlord hasn't heard from them in a while, and turns out they passed away. It's an old person. If they have a dog, the dog will sit by them and starve to death before it nibbles on the dead person. It takes a cat about 12 hours. The cat kind of bats at you a few times, says, "Yeah, he's dead," and then starts eating, and that's it. So the cats are fine. It's the dogs they worry about when they get by. So yes, I agree.
Yeah, just out of interest, is there any viruses that present us the kind of classic rotting flesh that you see on a zombie?
There's not viruses per se, but you've seen the flesh-eating bacteria, which are those are usually subsets of staph, although there's some streptococci that do it as well. They create this pemphigus ulceration, usually of mucosal membranes, but then spreads to the skin, and you start to see the skin rotting off. There's all sorts of normal venoms that do that. So the brown recluse spider, which is a North American toxic spider, will do that. It vasoconstricts the blood vessels as they lead to the place where it was bitten. So that area actually kind of rots and falls off. Gangrene is, that's also
we're eating it up.
Like.
We love it.
I know this is a very gross discussion. I'm sorry. Okay, yeah, good. Yeah, so there's a lot. And then, there's also some allergic responses to medications, which are actually fairly commonly prescribed medications, but these are rare allergic responses. There's a dermatologic condition called Stevens-Johnson syndrome. So you can get that from Bactrim, which is an antibiotic, lamotrigine, which is an anticonvulsant and a mood stabilizer. Those both lead to this sloughing off, first of mucosal membranes, then later it spreads to the skin, and it's horrible. It's a medical emergency. It's treatable, but you gotta get folks in.
How easy is it for a disease such as a zombie virus to spread by biting?
Not easy. So that's the big difference from the zombie stories. When I asked George why he had him bite other people, he said, because it's scarier that way. I said, good. And I said, why are they so slow? And he said, because they're dead. So he had all sorts of very straightforward answers. I've worked with some epidemiologists who've actually written about the zombie bug as the putative zombie bug as a model for looking at things like human papillomavirus and how it spreads, and that's usually through sexual contact. If you imagine a bug that could spread through biting, that would be like a pandemic of rabies. And it's hard to imagine a pandemic of rabies if the thing that's carrying the bug can barely walk, can barely move. All you got to do is put a fence around it. You notice it tries to bite you, you put a fence around it, and you're done. The problem's solved. So you would have, in order to get to pandemic level, and this isn't just me saying this, every epidemiologist has looked at this, you'd have to either have them rising from the dead, so then they could sort of come up out of the grave and you think you're done with them, but they're not, and they bite you on the ankle or something. Or more likely, you'd have an airborne bug, something like a flu virus.
And also, kind of the other symptom I was also wondering about is usually, I think in all the films, the zombies don't feel pain. I take it there's kind of known cases of that happening to people.
Right. So there are, you mean conditions where people don't feel pain?
Yeah, like you see quite often in these movies, like the zombies will get cut in half, but they just keep going and they don't seem bothered. Yeah,
they just keep going. Yep. In fact, they're neither perturbed nor happy about it. That's the thing that's so maddening about them. They just don't change their expression at all. There are certainly conditions like that. It's rare to not feel any pain, but it's relatively common, especially with substance use disorders and other syndromes, to have the pain suppressed because of whatever else is going on in your brain at the time. If you transect the spinal cord, you don't feel any pain, but you also can't move. So then you're sort of out of zombie land at that point. But if you're flying on PCP, you don't care about the pain. Even if this is like, I don't mean to make light at all of substance use disorders. They're awful. But even if any of you have ever had surgery and taken a Percocet, you recognize, it's not that the pain goes away, you just don't care. It's a dissociative feeling. So your ankle still hurts, you just kind of ignore it. So if you take that to like the 50th power, you start to get to that state without pain. High adrenaline does that too.
And just one thing about zombies is that they seem to effortlessly rip people apart without anything else other than their own bare hands and jaws. Is that actually physically possible for a person to do?
That's a great, I've always asked that. No one's ever asked me that. And it's a really cool question. It's actually easier than we like to think it is. We're actually pretty fragile creatures when you think about it. We just don't do this to each other because we're mostly civil and treat each other nicely and evolved and all those things. But if you wanted to just tear away at somebody, there are all sorts of places where there are vulnerabilities, the eye sockets, the nose, the mouth. All you have to do is get your hand into the fascia, into the skin. Once you get down to the muscle, it becomes harder, but there's usually something you can grab onto. The ribs will open up like a book. I mean, this becomes like a fairly grotesque discussion, but you have to wonder how could a fox, or a wolf tear open another animal? And they can do it. Even very, very weak ones can, because they know where the vulnerabilities are. The big issue with the zombie story is they don't know anything. So they're just kind of gripping and grabbing, and kind of through attrition, they find a way in. And if you're lucky, they don't, they grab something that they can't get into, or they bite off a toe or something.
And I don't know where this came into zombie folklore, but the whole zombie obsession with brains. Is there any reason that they would specifically have a craving for human brain?
No, it's one movie. It was one movie.
Yeah.
It was Return of the Night of the Living Dead.
Yeah, I thought so. But it seems to have just stuck. Everyone seems to think of that when they think of zombies.
I think, first of all, it's funny that them going brains, that just became this thing. People had to say something besides groan on the zombie walks that have become increasingly popular. And then I think because brains are themselves, this is my own kind of existential thinking about it, brains are themselves such amazing organs. Like you can look at a heart and you can hold it, and you can notice there's valves that only allow the blood to go one way and not the other, and there's thick muscle, and from it, just empirically, you can figure out what it does. But a brain, if you just they didn't know in the Middle Ages what a brain did. They'd put it on the table and they'd stare at it. They thought it was for cooling the blood. They really had no idea until literally the early 1800s, and that was only because they started noticing that when people got bashed in the head, as humans do to each other sometimes, they started acting differently. So it wasn't it wasn't just for cooling blood in a fever. So I think having the inexplicable eat the inexplicable carries more meaning.
And just on the brain itself, basically, if you can kill zombies, then there's surely some regions of the body that are still need to be active for a zombie to be, quote unquote, alive. Can these organs or these regions themselves, are they susceptible to infection? So basically, can a zombie get sick?
Yeah. So in the book I wrote, yes, and because they're fictional, we can say whatever we want. But in the book that I wrote, I wanted it to be as real as it possibly could, including the fact that it looks like it was an evil hedge fund manager who created the virus. I wanted to sort of nail Wall Street. It was right around, right after the collapse of 2008. So, yeah, all the organs are susceptible, but the brain is especially susceptible. But if you think about from a adaptive perspective, you need the contagion to keep whatever the carrier is mobile and up long enough in order to spread it. So the brain can only be affected so much. So you'd like to keep somebody up and about for as long as possible. That's why Ebola is it's a terrifying virus, but it's not a very adaptive virus because it tends to just run through a village really, really fast. So if you quarantine the village, it's scary and sad for the people in the village, but you're done. That's why it got so scary when the first cases made their way into the States, or where people panicked thinking that there were cases in the States, because Ebola in a big city is a totally different story. So yeah, the other organs are susceptible. Killing a zombie, the only way you can do it is by shooting him in the head. That was just something literally Romero made up on the spur of the moment when he was shooting Night of the Living Dead. But you can biologically get there by thinking the brainstem is the region that controls autonomic function. So the hearts beat, the lungs breathe. So presumably you bash in the head, you at some point damage or transect the brainstem. You guys know what George did for a living when he made Night of the Living Dead? Do you want to know?
Oh, I can't remember. I remember he was he just threw that movie together and kind of made it in editing almost.
He was a really important mentor to me, and it's just the sweetest man. He was at that time, I was 2 years old when that movie was made. At that time, he was the chief cameraman for Mr. Rogers, for the children's television show. And that's like George's personality. He's not this like creepy guy at all. He loves kids. He loves Westerns. What we would do when we would get together is watch Westerns. We'd watch Red River, and he would cry. Every time John Wayne got the girl in the end, he would cry. He said, "I'm going to cry, Schloz. I know it's going to happen again." So the reason I'm telling you this is like, the other thing George understood, and this is consistent with sort of the science side of things, is that horror is just a step removed, if you're lucky, from what it's just from normal life. That's the sort of strength and power of horror stories. And that's why he would always have these very clear social commentaries, not so subtly buried in his movies. The consumerism in Dawn of the Dead, the racism in Night of the Living Dead, the Hoffman's character in Day of the Dead, or Hopper's character, sorry. His name is Hoffman.
Because I've always felt that the most effective horrors are those that are just a slight step away from the reality we live in, because that disquietens you a bit more knowing that it is possible, whereas, the more fantastical ones, you can always, that would never happen anyway, so...
Yep, the other thing it does is it serves a purpose, because if you remove it just a step away, you can actually think about the real stuff. That's what the CDC did. You can think about the real stuff more readily and more comfortably. If you start thinking about a real flu pandemic, which is a possibility, not a huge one, but it's a possibility, it's terrifying. Nobody can go there. So it's a lot easier to think about a zombie pandemic and then say, okay, we already did all this thinking, but now let's use it, God forbid if it should ever happen.
He's done a lot of work on the mathematical modeling of a zombie outbreak. How does that work? How do you mathematically model an outbreak of something that turns people into zombies?
Robert was actually the guy I turned to. He and I spoke together at the Directors Guild of America out in L.A. when they premiered Survival of the Dead. Max Brooks was actually the MC of that. Robert's the guy I turned to, and I said, look, can I make this a pandemic through biting? And if you look at his papers, the answer is no. You absolutely can't. If you need for pandemics, you need exponential growth. So 1 infects 3, infects 12, infects 7. You need a logarithmic curve. It cannot be linear, because if it's linear, that gives the public health officials time to sort of intervene. And then eventually you get this S-shaped curve, so you've got very little infection, then you've got a huge increase. That's a logarithmic increase. And then it flattens out to be the top part of the S. The flattening out's not a good thing at the top. It just means there's no one else to infect. So if you've got on the y-axis there the number of infected people, it flattens out because everybody's already sick. Robert's work suggests that with the biting part, this is something you could contain if they die eventually, if they're just sick people who die. If there aren't sick people who die, if they keep living and biting and living and biting and they never ever die, then you could actually not, at least short of blowing their heads off, then you couldn't interrupt that pandemic possibility as
and what about people who may be resistant to the outbreak? What's that?
Yeah, that's key to every good zombie story. You've got to you don't have to have complete resistance, but it's rare to find the pandemic for which everybody is equally susceptible, unless it's designed. You can imagine in the sort of horrific world of biological weaponry that you're going to design something for the highest rate of infectivity, and that's actually a term you use. It's the infectivity is the likelihood of becoming sick upon exposure to a certain aliquot of virions, or assuming it's a virus, or a certain aliquot of whatever contagions you're using. So you will almost certainly have some people who are less susceptible or not susceptible at all, because that's the way it works with almost all diseases. Even with Ebola, there are folks who've gotten it and didn't get it. With HIV, there are people who get it and don't seem to show any symptoms. It's just extremely, extremely rare.
And so, what was just the general what gave you the kind of spark to go write this book, just to begin with?
Yeah, so I've wanted to be a writer since I was 8 years old. And I wanted to be a doctor since I was 26, and my dad made me. And I like doing both a lot. And I've written other things. I've written short stories and stuff. But this book, basically, it's kind of it's a sad story that has a happy ending. My wife, who's totally fine now, had breast cancer. And I was scared. My kids, who are now 17 and 12, were younger, and I couldn't sleep because we were just getting ready to do all the chemotherapy and stuff. And she's fine now. We're more than 6 years out. She had a very good prognosis. It's still a very good prognosis. But at the time, it was terrifying. So I got everybody to sleep, and I went downstairs and watched whatever happened to me on TV, and Night of the Living Dead was on. And it's always on because it's an eminent domain movie. George threw that movie together, and then he forgot to copyright it, literally. So that movie can be, that's why it's on YouTube entirely. without you pirate. It's not pirating. You cannot pirate Night of the Living Dead because it's an eminent domain film. It might be why zombies are so popular too, by the way, because it meant they could be shown at any theater, any time. So people just chose it for the B-reel all the time, for the B movies. So I watched that movie and I thought, I can't make my wife's cancer better. That's somebody else's job. But I can cure these zombies. So I sat down and I wrote this fake medical paper with both fake and real references. And I sent it to some friends, I sent it to some other friends, and it shot around the internet in this kind of viral way and ended up in an agent's hand, or not even a publisher's hand in New York. And they called me and said, hey, do you want to write something about this? And I said, yeah, could I write a novel? And they said, sure. And then because I'm in academics, I decided to write it for free, which is what we do in academics. And then a friend of mine called me and said, they're a for-profit company, so you should get an agent. So I did. And that's how it came out. So Grand Central Publishing, which is part of the Hachette Book Group, ended up doing it. The book still sells too. It still generates royalties, which is fun. It just got reoptioned for a miniseries that I wrote with Larry Fessenden. So it's still going. A virtual reality miniseries.
That sounds interesting.
For the Oculus. It was creepy to write, but it was fun. So it's that's how the book came about. They own the rights to the sequel, which I at some point have to write. I published other horror stories and worked on other screenplays, and have written most of the sequel.
I mean, are you ever surprised just at how inventive people get with zombies? It always seems someone's just able to come up with another one and another one. It doesn't stop surprising me at all. That
no, it's so cool. Like, I think because there's just a few rules. There's just a few very basic rules. And outside of those rules, that if you're even willing to accept the sort of fast versus slow moving, which people scream at each other at Comic-Con about, usually when they have that argument, and I've been on panels, I want to stop them from arguing, I just change the subject entirely and I say, who would win in a fight, Kirk or Picard? And then they're off and running in another direction, which is good, and I can sort of leave it alone. Yeah, I think if you're going to take fast versus slow, you make them cannibals, you make them kind of lose their capacity for anything except the kind of apparent rage of the hungry predator. Then you can play with the idea in all sorts of fascinating ways. Love stories, you can riff off Romeo and Juliet like in Warm Bodies. You can tell coming-of-age stories like in The Girl with All the Gifts. You can do social commentary like in Romero's movies. You could do things about global war the way Max did in World War Z. It's a very permissive trope.
Yeah, isn't there a series of books that riff off of classic novels like Jane Austen and some of those Pride and Prejudice and Zombies?
Yes, Seth Graham Greene did that. I'm so jealous I didn't have that idea because it was a brilliant idea. He took a book that's eminent domain, right? So there's no copyright violation to take Pride and Prejudice and just insert in it whole paragraphs as if there's a zombie outbreak. And then he was tickled, as was everybody, by how well it worked. So they would say things like, let us now retire to higher grounds for our picnic, for the zombies are feasting down below. And they would go have the romantic picnic with the zombie. It's just like having, foxes nearby. It was hilarious how well it worked. That's the same thing you see in Shaun of the Dead. He doesn't even notice that there's a problem at first. So a lot of zombie stories are also about how we sort of go through the world without noticing things. Things become in the periphery to the point where it becomes dangerous.
Yeah, that's also a bit of social commentary too. I think right there, what Shaun of the Dead does is because we just go through our daily routines day in and day out, and kind of get caught up and in the rush and flow of life without really thinking about big things and big ideas, and we kind of become zombies in a certain sense ourselves.
Yeah, that is the risk. That's the biggest risk. So the waiting in line at the Department of Motor Vehicles, you're a zombie. Unless you actively try not to become a zombie, they give you a number, they play music, and you shuffle forward. And the irony there is that it actually doesn't have to be that way. Like, you could listen to your iPhone, you can listen to music, you can talk to the person in front of you, but that sort of cautionary tale, especially for nowadays when the world seems like it's lost its mind, we don't have to sit back and take it. Like, I'm not calling for violent uprising. I just mean you can go vote, you can play a role in the political process, and that's a lot of what zombie stories are about people sort of giving up rather than figuring out a new way.
I'd just say, glad you mentioned Shaun of the Dead, because that seems it's such a broad film that it's got so much packed into it. I've never known such a comedy which also has, the Halloween scene where he has to shoot his own mother. It's like, it goes from that scene with the pool cues with the Queen music playing, and then 5 minutes later, it's this really harrowing scene, and it doesn't miss a beat, that film, at all. It's just a phenomenal movie, I think.
It's brilliant. It's, it's a real zombie film. So you can't say it's not a zombie film, despite the fact that it is funny as anything. It's even got lines directly from Night of the Living Dead. I don't know if you noticed that when, remember his mother's name was Barbara? So when they're going to rescue her, they say, "We're coming to get you, Barbara," which is the opening line in Night of the Living Dead. So they throw in these lines all the time. And it's a great commentary on especially 1990s working class, first world, and maybe especially the United Kingdom.
Oh, definitely. There's a lot of British references in there. I think you guys might have missed, but we got them completely.
I've only gotten them from my British friends.
All right.
I had a wild dinner one night, which was one of those dinners where you wonder what you're doing here, with George Romero and Malcolm McDowell. And McDowell was going over them with me, which was totally bizarre. So ironically, I was having dinner with two guys who one made and one starred in movies, both of which I was grounded for seeing before I was old enough to by my parents. So, which is
and talking about Shaun of the Dead.
So Clockwork Orange and this. Right. And talking about Shaun of the Dead in an Italian restaurant in Seattle. It was great. It was at a convention called ZombieCon, which was funny.
Well, there's an actual convention for zombies.
There was. It wasn't for. It was for zombie fans. Although there were some lots of folks dressed like zombies there as well. There's even a zombie wedding. Real people got married dressed as zombies, and Bruce Campbell got ordained and performed the wedding. So the guy from Evil Dead. It was pretty funny to watch. The vows were like, "Rah, rah, rah, rah." That was literally what they said. Which is another part of the zombie thing. It's people are having fun with it. Despite the seriousness of it, it's actually a good way to have a good time. Yeah,
that is kind of it is another thing, just the different tones of them. It's just, like I said, it's just this blank canvas. And in a way, it's quite similar to something myself and Nathan spoke about a few shows back. It sort of reminds me of the whole Slenderman idea. Slenderman is essentially this blank canvas and people are painting their own stories into it. It's it's a meme that's traveled so far, the zombie.
It's a great, you could make the case before we even had the phrase meme, because this was before there was the internet, and the meme, I think the idea of meme came from the notion of the rapid trading of ideas that the internet affords. Zombies could have been first, and they may have been first because it was an eminent domain film. So it could be rapidly traded without anybody having to pay anybody anything for it. If you're showing a movie, the irony is that it was the B-reel film. So, whereas before they had shown I Was a Teenage Werewolf, and it was a cautionary tale about not dating older men. Suddenly they're showing this devastating film, and people didn't know what to make of it. And then they started yanking it from theaters, but by that time the word got out.
Yeah, it is. It's almost transmitted like the plague does in the films in a weird way. It just it just spreads so quickly.
Yep, and one leads to and they're having the sort of popularity of zombies as a trope. They're having a kind of downswing right now, and you sometimes see that when the world becomes there's some folks have studied this, when the world becomes so frightening that it starts to mimic the movie more than you'd like it to, then it kind of drifts down, and it drifts back up again when things seem calmer. We can better sort of tolerate the displacement. So I don't think it'll ever go away, but they're definitely not as, like The Walking Dead is not as popular, and people are kind of used to that storyline now. It's gotten
I think it's like people always, their choice of escapism is they want the opposite of what every day is, in a weird way.
Right.
Yeah, I think we saw that at 9/11, September 11th attacks. There was a whole wave of films that were about to be coming out about international terrorism that were delayed or put on a back burner because of that event, and they said it's too soon, we can't put this out yet.
They were all yanked. And zombies, there's not going to be an international zombie attack. That will not happen as a position. I feel compelled to say that. But what's fascinating is like that, remember the guy ate the guy who was on bath salts and attacked the person in Florida? And everybody thought, the most parsimonious explanation was zombies, which, of course, the most parsimonious explanation is that they're high on something. But people will believe what they want to believe. And if you the internet also leads to that. So you Google, do zombies exist? Google will give you an answer yes, because Google senses that that's the answer you want. And the more you Google that question, the more evidence you'll get every time you Google. That's why when I was writing the book I wrote, if I Googled dinner and clicked images, I would get a picture of bacteria. That was the first image that came up on my computer, because all of my lit searches had been around how to understand pathogens. Whereas if my wife did it on her laptop, she'd get a salad. So it was...
Yeah, we talk a lot about skeptic issues on the show, and that's something that comes up all the time, is how terrible of a resource the internet can be for getting accurate information and learning how to filter out the pseudoscientific and sensational information from the good information.
It's definitely made it worse. The irony is that when the Orson Welles thing of War of the Worlds was done on the radio back in 1938, so the FCC had just been created. I wrote a piece about this for the New York Times. The FCC had just been created, and they recognized that this was a problem because people thought it was real. They thought Martians were... they packed churches. A few people threatened suicide. So there was sporadic panic. So the first solution the FCC had was, well, we think Congress should vet every story that ever gets dramatized at that point only on radio. And then the congressmen, and they were all men then, said, no, we're not doing that. So then their second idea was, we need to have some modality by which people can quickly assess whether or not something is real, some way of getting information out quickly, like the internet. They just didn't know that's what they were saying. And yet it's given the exact opposite of that, because there's so much extra stuff on there. There's no kind of good way to triangulate your research, or at least we don't know how to do it well yet. There are ways to do it, and they try to teach kids, but we're not so good at it. So if you want proof that zombies exist, you can find it online. It's easy.
So is there for lack of a better word, a zombie truther community where they actually believe it's happening?
Yeah, it always, Max and I have talked about this, Max Brooks and I. There are folks, they don't necessarily believe it's happening now. I haven't met anybody who says that, but there are people who think that it's going to happen anytime, and their preparations are real. Like, they're arming up, and they might just have this as an excuse to arm up because they like arming up. But there definitely are folks who are preparing for some kind of crazed, barbaric, and I think in some ways they're hoping for a simpler time. Like, there's this misconstrued notion that if the world were suddenly reduced to this, life would just be simpler. We would just set up our perimeters. We wouldn't have to do our homework. You wouldn't have to worry about paying your taxes. You just defend your family. And there's something kind of romanticized about that, which is, of course, completely absurd. It would be awful. No one would have any teeth. You'd die early. It'd be terrible. Yeah.
So do you think zombies have maybe had an influence on that kind of survivalist community? Maybe they don't believe in the zombies, but they've got that kind of paranoia of some apocalyptic future like that, and it's kind of influenced from that media. Yeah. Yeah,
absolutely. In fact, I get not a lot, but more than I'd like to, notes from folks who are kind of that survivalist community. I don't ever feel threatened. It just makes me worried that there are people, stockpiling like John Goodman does in Cloverfield Lane, like all this stuff in the bunkers. And the zombie story, it's a little bit about whether the tail's wagging the dog. Is the zombie story creating that, or are they creating the zombie story? And probably one ricochets off the other, back and forth.
Yeah, because on Netflix here in the UK, I don't know if you've seen, I think it's a US show, but it's called Doomsday Bunkers. Have you heard of this?
I haven't, no.
And it's a whole show about this company that makes these survivalist bunkers. And it's, in one retrospect, it's hilarious what these people are spending hundreds and thousands of their dollars on, but it's actually quite terrifying to see how much, like you said, they're about arming. I'm going to protect my family no matter what. I'm going to get all these guns and all that. And it's like, and also just it's fascinating, bro. I was glued to it because it was just, my jaw was hitting the floor that this actually exists in a way.
Yeah, no, I gave a lecture at North Georgia State University, which is a very cool school north of Atlanta. It's where they filmed Deliverance, and folks there. It's funded by the Department of Defense here in the state. So about half the students there are going to be soldiers. And afterwards, this kid came up to me. It's mostly rural kids who go there, and he said, "I'll tell you what," which is the way that means I haven't said anything yet. I'm about to say something, so I want you to listen. So he said, I'll tell you what, if there's a zombie outbreak, I'm going to hole up with my grandma because she's a better shot with a shotgun than half the boys on this here campus. And I said, well, wait a minute. You've read the books. I mean, that's not a good strategy. Even if your grandma's a great shot, you're going to run out of ammo. And he said, pardon me, sir, but you ain't seen my grandma's basement. So it was, and he was totally polite. He was laughing about it. And so this guy's grandma is, she's a survivalist. She's the one to be with when it all hits the fan. No, I should say it's a very strange thing, the whole survivalist ethos thing. And, if you take it too far, and the sort of skeptic part here is worth thinking about, because if you take it too far in the movies, as they did in The Road, it's an amazing book and it's an amazing movie, but nobody went to see it. It was so hard to watch. It was too close to what you could actually imagine, presumably a nuclear holocaust looking like. So I think that's another reason they hang around in the zombie displacement. There you can tolerate it better. The Road is a great film, but I am not watching that more than once, whereas I'll watch Dawn of the Dead over and over and over.
Oh, yeah. I think I've seen The Road once. That's the one with the father and his little kid, isn't it?
Yeah.
And basically their paranoia just overcomes them in the end.
Yeah, the kid, spoiler alert, the kid makes it, but and in the book, actually, he does, it's even more harrowing. It's a Cormac McCarthy book. He's the same guy who wrote No Country for Old Men, and so he's not exactly a happy guy all the time, but he's a great writer. But yeah, it's about once everything falls apart, once the infrastructure is completely gone, both the natural infrastructure, like the ecosystem, and the man-made infrastructure, we got nothing. We're worse off than rats, basically.
Yeah, I think it's interesting the alien element of it, the foreignness and alienness of the plot element is kind of serves as kind of a buffer to keep us comfortable and keep our distance from something that's harrowing and frightening.
That's been the purpose of horror stories since people have been telling them.
I'm thinking of something like Stephen King's The Mist. Are you familiar with that story?
Oh, yeah.
And the way in which stories like that lend themselves to alternate endings and splitting off into different ways of telling the same story, because the book version of The Mist has the denouement of it, the climax of it has an optimistic note to it, whereas the movie version has a terrible tragic ending.
Yeah. I know both of those endings, and you can play with those. The same thing happened in 28 Days Later. So the British version of 28 Days Later has a much more pessimistic ending than does the American version. So and then actually in the first version of the movie version of World War Z, Brad Pitt dies. And then the studio said, no, the world's #1 leading man does not die. He lives for a sequel. So they went back and they shot that third part of the movie, which is really the only truly zombie part of the movie, where he's just in that one lab, I think in Scotland. And there's that kind of reptilian creature trying to bite him, or the human that's reptile-like.
Because I've got questions on stuff like, I don't know, maybe it's a bit silly, like, would an immune system of a zombie still be fully functional?
It doesn't. I doubt it, because it's hard to be that sick. But most zombie stories have zombies with high fevers. The fever is an immune response, so we know that there's some immune system working. One of the signs of somebody being super sick is their inability to mount a fever, super sick from a contagion. So they're mounting a fever. If they can do that, it means that they can still protect themselves from some other bugs. That's why we get fevers, because the heat is what kills the contagion. So it's going to work, but after a while, the amount of metabolic energy necessary to keep your immune system functional becomes overwhelming for the organism, as the organism is itself trying to stay functional. That's why you need to rest when you're sick. So if you're going around eating instead of resting, you're going to use up the immune reserves at that point, and it'll peter out.
My favorite plot zombie stories are probably the Romero stories, but second to that would be The Walking Dead. But the problem I see with The Walking Dead is the length of it. The 7 seasons and soon to be 8 seasons, just the length of the story kind of works against it, because the longer I watch that show, the longer I think, or the more I think that a short story, relatively short story about zombies works better, because you have to wonder how they keep going, because how are they producing? How are they continuing to produce ATP for all that time, for example?
Yeah, that's why, from a scientific standpoint, The Walking Dead just stops working right away. They can't make adenine triphosphate. They can't make ATP. They're not, besides the fact that there's entropy. So in addition to not being able to make ATP, they're just plain getting older. So as you get older, entropy catches up with you and your organ systems fail. So it's hard to figure out. I mean, unless it's magic, you could sort of do the sort of like this is a curse from the Almighty or something, which is a lot of the background theme of the show. If you do that, then you can have this sort of plague going on and on and on. But if you're going to make it scientific, as they tried to do in that episode with the CDC, at some point they're going to die. They're not going to live 7 seasons, despite the fact that the show's still making a profit. Yeah,
which is kind of which makes it interesting that the one character, Maggie's father, I'm blanking on his name right now, but he actually made a reference to Herschel. Yeah, he actually in the second season he made a reference to this outbreak being like a divine judgment.
Yeah, so he's there's always some character in The Walking Dead who's kind of a prophetic character. There's, even before Herschel, there was the guy who owned the RV. I forgot his name in the first season. Sort of older guy who kind of keeps the ethical standard. He's like the keeper of what's good and what we need to remember to be human. But the idea that it's prophetic. Oh, George has that in Dawn of the Dead. He's got that line that he just made up where the one of the soldiers says, "My grandpa always said that when the what does he say, when hell is full, the dead will rise and walk the earth," or something like that. So, and he's just made that up. Like there's no actual saying like that. He just threw it in there just for kicks.
Yeah, but I think it's lived on. I think I've come across folk that will swear that's in the Bible somewhere.
Well, so there are lines like that. Yeah, but it also has this kind of it has a biblical feel to it, doesn't it? I mean,
it's kind of epic on a biblical scale. A lot of these stories.
Right. Yeah, and that's that's what the plagues were when you think about it. You think about the 10 plagues in the Old Testament. It's also very Old Testament-y, except for the last book of the New Testament. Then it starts to get more in line with the zombie stuff. But otherwise, it's mostly fire and brimstone, which is more the stuff of my people, right?
I think it just has to be see if there is like some kind of disaster on a zombie scale. Is it just inevitable that society's just going to be turned into essentially something like Mad Max, or could will decent people prevail in it?
Boy, wish I knew the answer to that, seeing as I got 2 kids I'm about to send out.
Yeah, the only kind of metric I go by is like, say, the recent hurricanes in the States, and people band together to help each other and go out and help. So that's how I always look at it. In times of disaster, we always want to help each other rather than, the people directly affected, they're obviously stricken in that, but everyone on the outside wants to go in and, let's get these people back up.
Yep. It's so scary to think how close to the brink we are a lot of the time. But then if you turn that on its head, it's kind of uplifting. I mean, it's easy. I'm obviously in the first world too. Like if I lived in another part of the world, which just by luck I happen not to, it would really be a question as to whether I'd have water to drink tonight. So we are going to get to this place, I think, where the number of people without so outweighs the number of people with, that something has to change. And then my hope is that what we saw with the hurricanes will actually happen more globally. And I mean, that's my optimistic outlook. I think that will happen, but it's scary to think of what would happen if that doesn't happen.
Well, on that note, I think we are in a good place to wrap up. So if anybody wants to learn more about your work, where can they find you, Steve?
So on Twitter, it's at Zombie Autopsies. I'm just laughing because the med school still wants me to change that, but I ain't gonna. So it's at Zombie Autopsies. Folks are welcome to email me through my Gmail account. That's always fun to get notes. It's Schlozman@gmail.com. Or you can buy the book. If you buy the book, I'll sign it for you. I can say that. And folks, it's fun.
I've just got the Kindle versions.
I can sign your Kindle, or I could send it to you. Thank you for buying it, though. I'm glad you bought it.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I'm really enjoying it. I haven't finished it yet. There was some other things came up this week, but I'm about 3/4 of the way through. I'm really enjoying it. It's a kind of fresh take on things. It's like we said earlier, this kind of blank slate that zombies offer people.
You can have a lot of fun with it. I'm glad you're enjoying it.
Last week, I described your book as kind of the Martian of zombie stories.
I like that. I'll take that. Boy, I love that. I love The Martian. Wow. And if I can get Matt Damon to play Stanley Bloom, that would be the biggest coup. Could Matt Damon the F out of it or whatever, as he says in the movie and the book. Thanks, guys. So this is really fun.
Yeah, thank you for joining us.
It was my pleasure.
And we'll see you all next week.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Trolling with Logic. If you enjoy this podcast, please consider leaving us a review on iTunes. If you love the show, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Supporting us at $5 or more per episode will get you access to exclusive, patron-only bonus content, early access to shows before everyone else, and other incentives. We are an amateur production, but with your patronage, we can help improve our audio quality and cover the costs for doing the show. We are grateful for anything you can pledge to the show. Go to www.patreon.com/trollingwithlogic to sign up if you are so inclined. We want to thank our 4 patrons who currently have chosen to support us. These patrons are Microbloganism, Josh at the Society for the Advancement of Science, Avinash Kumar, and Brian Curran. Thank you very much for your support, which is helping us out. If you have any suggestions for topics or guests you would like to hear on this show, let us know on Twitter or on our Facebook page. Thanks again for listening.
Nevertheless will devour you. And I think that's a pretty good metaphor for what modern life is like. You know, it's the same as being
This is something that this idea of the zombie as a blank slate that isn't really about the zombie itself, but about how humans respond to it. This is where I think the appeal and greatness of shows like The Walking Dead come in, because what The Walking Dead does is it isn't really about the zombies. It's about humans and their response to it, and the biggest threat in The Walking Dead is other humans.
Oh yeah, by far. I mean, the zombies aren't a problem. All you have to do is walk slightly faster to get away. They're stumbling. But if you decide you can't sit next to somebody because you don't like the color of their skin, you're in trouble, because we need each other more than we don't need each other.
Yeah, I also think zombie stories probably tap into our evolutionary past in some way. There's a fear we've inherited and that we still carry around, like in our reptilian brain, a fear of predators and being eaten. And I think that's part of the appeal of it. It taps into something in our reptilian brain, and it also taps into something higher up. I think the loss of identity is also something people are scared of. Somebody familiar to us, or who was familiar to us, is now this relentless monster who wants to not have dinner with us, but eat us.
Right. And doesn't even, it's not even about you. Like, even if it was, if you think about like, the classic foggy football field, and there's what you think and hope is your girlfriend stumbling across the field out of the fog, and she might be dragging her foot, but you think maybe it's broken, and then she might take a bite out of somebody, and you still think to yourself, God, I hope it's just her and I can make her better. And you wait just long enough for her to bite you. But the irony there is that
breaks in general. What's science and what's fiction? Welcome to the show, Dr. Stephen Schlozman.
Thanks. You have to call me Steve. Only my mother calls me Dr. Schlozman. So,
I guess the first question we'll go with is talking about your book itself. Could it be considered a hard science fiction novel, falling into that kind of genre of stories that are informed by real science as much as possible?
Yeah, no, that was the goal. So some folks have called it speculative fiction. It's not quite as speculative as something like Black Mirror, which is amazing and horrifying because it's so close to possible. I should lead. In fact, I begin every one of these discussions with the disclaimer, which is, by the way, required by my employer. This may come as a surprise to you, but Harvard is a bit of a stodgy place, and so they have suggested that I always remind people that zombies are fiction, in case people think otherwise. So I'm going to be very clear about that. but I wanted to write it as if they weren't. So I tried to use the neurobiology and the pathology and also the microbiology to make a zombie apocalyptic scenario as believable as possible, and then to figure out how we could do what doctors do, which is not blow their heads off, but to make them better, to cure. These are sick people, so we try and cure them. And it kind of works in the novel. I think the novel works. Whether we cure the zombies, that's the question.
Yeah, I would agree that the novel works if for no other reason than we have things like the CDC using the idea of a zombie apocalypse to teach disaster preparedness.
Oh, yeah. In fact, you want to hear a funny story about that? Can I tell you a funny story? I know this. This is my funny story. The CDC talked about disaster preparedness, used the disease that I made up in this book, ataxic neurodegenerative satiety deficiency syndrome, ANSD. They just used it, which is fine. It was cool. But they misspelled my last name, which is totally fine with me, but not fine with my nice Jewish mother, who was very upset and actually called the CDC. Like, she called my Kansas City-based nice Jewish mother, calls up the CDC and says, "I'm very pleased you put my son in there, but could you please spell his last name correctly?" And they changed it like within seconds. She must have terrified them in some way, which she's been doing since I was 4, when she would like march into the schools and talk to the principals and stuff. So yes, the CDC did use zombie preparedness as a model for all disaster preparedness, whether it's a pandemic or a natural disaster. And actually, it maps pretty well.
Yeah, there's one thing I've always wondered, and it's just the whole zombie phenomenon. It's like the one, like all other genres of horror go through their phases of popularity, but zombies just seem to be this constant, and there's always this appeal to it. What is it about it that keeps, that movie makers and novelists and all that, they just seem to find it so fertile for stories?
They're blank slates by definition, not even as a metaphor. They are by definition blank. So you can project onto them, displace onto them any idea that you're working with. I knew George Romero very well. He passed away this summer, but he actually optioned the book I wrote, and we wrote the screenplay together. So we had a good time with that. He would say zombies are the thing that happens. Like they're not about zombies themselves. They're about how humans respond to zombies. And, if you think about it, like a vampire wants you to think you're sexy. You might not be sexy, but the vampire's whole thing is to make you think you're sexy. The werewolf's like an angry dog, like ghosts want to scare you. Zombies are just crocodiles. They don't really care. You can't get mad at a zombie. It's like getting mad at a crocodile. So it becomes this everything, this sort of mindless thing that people will believe what they want to believe. And if the internet also leads to that. So you Google, do zombies exist? Google will give you an answer yes, because Google senses that that's the answer you want. And the more you Google that question, the more evidence you'll get every time you Google.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Trolling with Logic, where I'm not going to go with the standard introduction that we usually go with, because we're talking about something a little bit different this time. That's kind of on the borderlands between science and fiction. We're talking about brains and zombies, and what science has to say about it. Our special guest for this episode is Dr. Stephen Schlozman. He is an assistant professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. His clinical work focuses on psychotherapeutic and psychopharmacologic treatments, and his academic work is geared not only towards the psychiatric treatment of medically ill children, but also curriculum reform and educational endeavors for medical students. He's the author of the 2011 novel, The Zombie Autopsies, Secret Notebooks from the Apocalypse, a story of a zombie outbreak told from the point of view of a medical researcher. He joins us on the podcast to talk about the medical research that informs his novel and about zombie out.
At least she's biting you. So in some ways she still cares about you, except she doesn't. You could step to the right and she'll bite the guy next to you. So this mindless predatory fear that we have. I think if something's going to eviscerate us, we'd like it to be about us. Like you want your guts to matter. And the idea that that your guts aren't any more special than the other guy's guts, that's absolutely terrifying. And then the higher brain stuff is, trying to figure out what to do. There's this whole philosophical world of studying zombies. They talk about inverse zombies and physical zombies, P zombies and I zombies. And the physical zombies are the ones like Romero thought about, stumbling around upright. And then the big philosophical question is, are they conscious by definition? Because how do you define consciousness? If they're up, if they're seeking food, if they're responding to stimuli, is that the same thing as you and I when we're seeking, a bowl of cereal in the middle of the night? Whereas the inverse zombie are the kind of creepy stories you hear about people who the doctors think are under general anesthesia, but they're not, and they go ahead and do the surgery. So that's actually the phrase they use in the philosophical papers. So it lends itself to all of these highbrow discussions that are a lot easier to have in the displacement of a zombie story than they are in real life, but they're real life questions.
I also think one of the appeals of the zombie genre is that a lot of people who enjoy it have some form of escapism. Everybody thinks that if a zombie apocalypse does occur, they'll instantly become the next Rick Grimes or the next Daryl Dixon. And so, which of course, this isn't going to happen.
Everyone's got their plan. I always tell people, I'm a shrink, so I'm not going to be much use in the field if someone's blown their arm off or something. I can't really hang a picture, so I'm not going to be good at building anything. I'm not a very good shot. I shot rifles in summer camp. I'm going to have to tell stories, but then I think